Here's an overview as prepared by Real Clear Politics of the Electoral College based on composite polling. You'll see from the graphic at the bottom right that the red and pink states are solidly likely or leaning Trump, while the dark and light blue states are solidly likely or leaning Biden. And we showed this map during our first webinar on the US presidential campaign 2 weeks ago. And the only difference between that map and the map now is that Minnesota is now considered a toss-up state as opposed to leaning Biden as it was 2 weeks ago. So that brings Biden's tally of electoral college votes from 226 to 216. Now, Biden still enjoys a considerable advantage in the electoral college on the basis of these numbers, needing to find only another 54 electoral college votes to reach the magic number of 270 to be elected president. Now, this next slide shows what happens in the electoral college if the polling on a state-by-state basis turns out to be correct, which it almost never is. Now, when I showed this slide 2 weeks ago, Ohio was actually leaning Biden and is now leaning Trump, where the composite polling shows a lead for Trump in this state of 0.6%. Now, notwithstanding this shift, the Electoral College map continues to show a potentially commanding lead for Joe Biden and the makings of a veritable landslide. And just for the record, a true landslide in the vernacular of US presidential elections means that a presidential candidate gets more than 55% of the total votes cast nationally. Now, that seems all but unthinkable in the current context, but it's actually happened on 18 occasions during contested US presidential elections, the most recent being Ronald Reagan in 1984. So if we go back to the map, which included the toss-up states, I've taken the liberty of putting Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina in the Trump column. Now, this scenario is far from certain. In fact, the state-by-state composite polling shows Trump leading only in Texas at the moment and actually trailing Biden in Florida by 1.6%, trailing him in Georgia by 1.2%, and Trump trailing Biden in North Carolina by 2.3%. So just given how the math is working out, it seems reasonable to assume that Trump will have to carry most, if not all, of these states to have a realistic path to 270 electoral college votes and re-election. Now, of the remaining toss-up states in gray, Biden currently leads the composite polling in all of them. He's up by more than 6 points in Minnesota. He's up by nearly 8 points in Michigan. He's leading by 4 points in Pennsylvania. He's up by 6 points in Wisconsin, more than 3 points in Arizona, and nearly 2 points in Iowa. So I've made reference to the composite polling, and I wanted to show it to you because it's actually really interesting, especially that it shows what the polling indicated exactly 4 years ago during the 2016 presidential campaign. Obviously, Hillary Clinton leading in most states with substantial leads in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. These were all 3 states that Trump won by less than 1% of the statewide vote. And you'll note that for every state shown on the list, Trump manages to outperform the composite polling averages, and in some cases by a considerable margin. In Ohio, he actually shifts 7 points, this being what the polling said, this being what the actual results were. Iowa, similarly, more than 7 points. Wisconsin, nearly 7.5 points. Michigan, 8 points, 8.5 points actually. And Florida, just under a 3-point shift. Now, it's funny, these 5 states, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida, have something else in common. They all went for Obama in both 2008 and 2012, but ended up going with Trump in 2016. Now, there's been a lot written and said about why voters in these particular states did what they did, and I think our panelists will be touching upon that to a fair extent. But what's clear is that in 2016, there were a lot of Trump supporters out there that the pollsters just didn't pick up. So we'll have to see if that's the case in 2020. But if it is the case, if we do see a similar shift in what the pollsters say to what the actual vote is, similar to what happened in 2016, this is what happens. You actually end up with Donald Trump being reelected. In fact, this is nearly identical to the results of 2016, with the only difference being that Georgia ends up in the, I'm sorry, my apologies, I got the wrong slide. Georgia ends up in the Democratic column because of the sort of strange mathematical formulation we're using for the purpose of this exercise. If you got to think, though, that if Trump's winning Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, he's probably winning Georgia, and he's winning over 300 electoral college seats. So let me show you in closing what I think is a much more realistic scenario as we approach Election Day. Let's assume that Trump wins where he has to in order to avoid a blowout at the hands of Joe Biden. So we're going to give Trump Arizona, we're going to give him Florida, we're going to give him Georgia, we're going to give him North Carolina, and we're going to give him Iowa, all very plausible. Conversely, we're going to give Biden Minnesota, we're going to give him Wisconsin, and we're going to get him Michigan. So you'll see that that leaves you with a deadlock in the Electoral College of 259 to 259, and all eyes on the last remaining swing state, which is Pennsylvania. And it so happens that Pennsylvania is one of 4 states out of 50 that waits until Election Day to count its mail-in ballots. And we all know how many mail-in ballots there are to be counted. So it suggests that we may not know the results from Pennsylvania till very late in the evening, or conceivably following Election Day. One thing to watch, of course, is always Florida. Florida tends to report reasonably early, like the 2000 presidential election, the Gore-Bush deadlock being the notable exception. But if Florida goes Biden, we'll probably have a good sense of that happening by about 9 o'clock Eastern on election night. And if that happens, then Joe Biden is the 46th president of the United States.